All right. I hope you can all hear me and see me. And it's a real delight to welcome everyone to the Koch Institute virtually during this 10th anniversary celebration year. We have lots of upcoming programming to celebrate this important anniversary in addition to tonight's conversation. And I hope that many of you will be able to join many of those events. So as you know, tonight I have the real pleasure of formally introducing our new director, Dr. Professor Matt Vanderheiden, to all of you. It's really exciting to have a chance to interview Matt as part of the celebration of the Koch Institute for Integrative Cancer Research's 10th anniversary. And frankly, it's a wonderful way to introduce Matt as the Koch Institute's second director, following Tyler Jacks, the Koch Institute's founding director. So I'm going to start the evening with a conversation with Matt, but we welcome your questions. So put them in the Q&A, and we're going to get to as many as we possibly can later in the hour. I have to say, as I thought about it, it's really pretty remarkable to be celebrating our 10th anniversary. Doesn't seem that long ago when we launched this incredible experiment. And it's totally amazing to reflect on all that the Koch Institute has accomplished, as well as its future promise. As most of you know, I've been closely involved with the Koch Institute since its inception, and I worked very closely with Tyler and the founding members to get it off the ground. Tyler and his colleagues came to me when I first arrived at MIT as its new president to describe their idea. And I don't know, in retrospect, it makes sense, but at the time, you could have considered that idea to be audacious or insane. You could take your pick. And the idea was that we could combine fundamental biology with engineering and clinical cancer expertise to accelerate progress in designing new ways to prevent, to diagnose, and to cure cancer. Of course, you know, we wouldn't be celebrating this 10th anniversary if those intrepid pioneers had not proved their thesis, which they certainly have done in myriad ways. Not only have the investigators, the students, the staff at the Koch Institute increased the pace of discovery and produced all kinds of papers in the highest impact journals. They've increased funding with unprecedented, perfect scores on renewals of the big comprehensive cancer center grant. That's never happened before. But they've also attracted the enthusiasm of people around the country and of donors, and brought wave after wave of students and faculty into the mix. You know, those efforts have spun out more than 100 new companies, many of which have moved their innovations into clinical trials. However, the thing that gives me most satisfaction and frankly most joy is talking to members of the Koch Institute's faculty, staff, and students, and to hear their passion for our purpose. That purpose takes us from fundamental discoveries in biology to advanced clinical interventions. So this is just a terrific time to talk with Matt and to hear from him how he sees where we are and where we might go next. So enough from me. Let's start to hear from Matt, our new director. So Matt, welcome to your new role. And before we get into the big questions, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, how you came to cancer research and cancer care, what you do in your lab, and have you always been interested in big questions about cancer?
Yeah, so thanks, Susan. So first of all, I want to, start off by saying how honored and humbled I am to take on this new responsibility. What you and Tyler have built has been truly amazing, and I look forward to the exciting challenges ahead, and to talking to you about some of the ways that we may meet those coming forward. In terms of telling you a little bit about myself, I mean, obviously we could talk about this a long time. I never clear where to start. I grew up in the Midwest, so I grew up in Wisconsin, and it was really when I was in college that I discovered that research was something that I was interested in and maybe good at. Not everyone comes, sometimes it's easy to look at one's professors or leaders and say, wow, this person must have always been at the top of their game, but I wasn't. My first job was actually washing dishes in a lab. And it was really during that period of time, the grad students would sneak me some experiments and I sort of realized I like science, and I always had an interest in medicine as well. And I heard about these MD PhD programs, and I was lucky enough to talk my way into one of them. And it was then really when I was going through the PhD portion of my my MD PhD training when I really, discovered that, wow, there's a lot we don't understand about the way biology works. Up until that point, much of what I learned in class was sort of like, you memorize what you learn in class and then you try to apply that to, medicine or other things. And it was that sort of realization that there's frontiers of what we know. And that was sort of an exciting moment for me, because it was this realization that maybe if we could increase the discovery, push the boundaries of our knowledge, we could then take that findings in a real way back to the clinic and help real people solve the problems that I was beginning to see during my medical training in the hospital, where, we didn't have the right solutions for people. And as I finished my PhD, I realized, well, I really wanted to build a career in science and incorporate some sort of biological discovery into my future career, hopefully combining that with clinical medicine. And when I was going through my clinical training, what I realized is that I kept being drawn to problems with cancer. First of all, because those were problems that I knew we needed to do better at, right? There is so many people suffering from cancer and not enough good solutions to the problems they were facing. And it was an area that I felt like really appreciated science. And there was this revolution in our understanding of biology that was coming, and was like, wouldn't it be cool to be part of this wave where, if we're really going to try to make a difference in the world, that you could apply it to one of the, really hard problems in the clinic. And this is not to belittle other problems in the clinic. People suffer from all kinds of things, but certainly cancer was a problem that felt like, I enjoyed taking care of clinically, felt like there was some frontiers and some new opportunities to try and tackle. And it was really there where I said, well, maybe I could make a difference in the clinic taking care of cancer patients, and maybe at the same time I could also make a difference in the lab and try to find better solutions to help the patients that I was seeing in the clinic. It was with that backdrop that I came to Boston for the first time. I came to Boston to do my clinical training. I actually moved to Cambridge because my wife got a job at MIT. That's actually the real reason why we moved to why we moved to Boston, in addition to the excellent clinical training here. And then as we moved through, I was lucky enough to be hired as, so I did training in medical oncology. Did postdoctoral research on cancer metabolism, something that happy to talk about more if you want. And then from there, it was really had this amazing opportunity. Phil Sharp called me up and said, hey, did you hear about this new thing we're pulling together, the Koch Institute, and might you be interested in applying? And I have to say, I was incredibly excited about what you guys were building, right? This opportunity sounded exactly what I was looking for. Like, could you bring new approaches, new ways of thinking about problems, people who thought about things in different ways together? And that just felt like something that would be really exciting to be a part of. I felt being part of the Koch Institute and MIT community could really catalyze my science in a way that wasn't there before, and maybe find new solutions for patients. And ultimately, that is what brought me to the Koch Institute. And I have to say, I've been incredibly excited to be a member of the Koch. And when I was asked if I might want to try to fill the gigantic shoes of Tyler and lead us into the second decade, it was really one of those offers that it was just too great of an opportunity to pass up. And I'm incredibly excited about where all of us can go together, because we really have an amazing community here.
Terrific, Matt. And by the way, I forgot to say thank you when we started. Taking on these leadership roles, I would say, is not the easiest thing to do, because you have to leave a lot by the wayside as you move to. But leadership, as you know, I believe leadership is incredibly important. And there's a lot of opportunity out there, but we need great leadership to get there. Also, great everybody, great leadership. So listen, I want to go back to this, what your lab works on. So you work on cancer metabolism, and I'm going to want you to tell everyone what that is but interestingly, it was a pretty hot topic about 100 years ago. So, biologists have, let's just say, thought about cancer metabolism before we knew about DNA, RNA, and how RNA makes proteins. But it fell out of fashion, but here we are again. So for those who don't follow this area, can you explain to us what cell metabolism is and why it's important for cancer?
Yeah, so metabolism is one of those topics that everyone's really at some level interested in, right? It's something that even my kids understand. We all eat food and we all ask, is this a healthy diet? And at some level, we all know that the food we eat gives us the energy that we need to live and to grow. And if one goes back 100 years, 150 years, those were the big biological questions people were trying to tackle, right? How does biology work? How does biology get the energy that it needs to move forward? And it was really somewhat of an accident because people weren't studying cancer 100 years ago. It was really an accident that led to people making an observation that cancer did metabolism a little differently. And it actually did so at a time before we even understood what we understand today about metabolism. But it was really this German biochemist, Otto Warburg, who did an experiment actually following up Louis Pasteur of pasteurization and fermentation. It was really following up his work, really asking how much the findings of Pasteur held if one went into animal tissues. And what Warburg found was that, cancer did things a little bit differently than most of the other tissues in our body. And that was really exciting at the time because, cancer has always been, going back, millennia, people have known cancer was a devastating disease. People got diagnosed with tumors. People tried to cure it with surgery. It didn't always work. People tried to cure it with radiation at the turn of the century. When this was done, no one really understood this disease at all. And this was the first molecular insight that there might be something different. And, you have to then fast forward another 80 years before one really gets into the next phase almost of cancer research. But I fell out of fashion for a couple of reasons. It fell out of fashion partially because, unfortunately, a little bit of the arrogance of the discoverer led to some claims that turned out to not be true. The observations were always true, but some of the claims were not. But I think it was actually really the remarkable revolution in molecular biology and understanding the genetics of cancer, that it was gene mutations that were driving cancer and that one can manipulate genes. Some of the, really seminal work that started at the original MIT Center for Cancer Research, right? How one could manipulate genes and use those in the discovery of oncogenes. That ended up being the hot topic in cancer research, and people kind of moved forward thinking about that. And some of these old observations about metabolism were, I don't want to say forgotten about, but let's just say moved to the back burner, right? That was sort of viewed as like, oh, right, in the 50s, we figured out how cells get the energy they need. Let's now move on and ask the questions about genes. And it was really how I came back to this was really in graduate school. I was studying a process of what keeps cells alive and how metabolism might intersect with that. And in the process of doing those studies, came to this realization that, wow, we don't understand metabolism as well as I thought we did when I took that class that I guess I now have the pleasure to teach to MIT undergrads. And it was really that realization that said, wow, there's a tremendous opportunity here. There's an opportunity here because there's this old observation that metabolism is different in cancer. We don't really understand why and how that works. And now we have all this research and advancement in understanding the genetics and some of the other pathways that drive cancer. Maybe there's this opportunity to bring these two things together and answer questions about how some of our cancer drugs work, why some of our cancer screening tests work. And that has been very exciting. And it's really led us back to questions that I think patients really care about. Patients care about, I've been diagnosed with cancer. What should I eat? That's not an easy question, even today in 2020, for us to answer. And I think really fundamentally asking, how do cancers interface with the nutrients in their environment, is really a scientific question that I still find very fascinating. And I think ultimately can, matters to things real patients care about too. And that's really, I guess, in a nutshell, what my lab has studied, and I hope what we can continue to make an impact in the coming years.
So Matt, that's really fascinating. The course of anyone's career is always idiosyncratic and interesting. So thanks for sharing that with us. So obviously, you are the first practicing oncologist to lead MIT's cancer research program, going back to the Center for Cancer Research. And it is often pointed out to me that MIT doesn't have a medical school or a hospital. We have some good neighbors with the medical school and some hospitals. But can you just reflect a little bit for all of us? Because everyone who leads whether it's the Center for Cancer Research or it's the Koch Institute, people bring a set of their own experiences. And so in what way does your work with patients affect how you think about cancer research? And part of that is this question about people who wear two hats. And so we know that we've got people who we call engineers and people who we call biologists and people who we call clinicians inside this building that's sitting, behind me on my screen. But, from your perspective, tell us a little bit how these ideas are integrated within a single person. And then, of course, how you relate to the other people at the Koch Institute with other kinds of background, because I think that's really at the center of the thesis of the Koch Institute, is that, we can mix and match to approach things in a different way. So tell us a little bit, starting out with your interesting combination of expertise, and then, perhaps broaden it.
Yeah, no, I guess I'm a bit of a rare bird in the sense that I'm a practicing oncologist at a basic cancer center without a hospital. And it was actually a really interesting career decision that I was faced with when I finished my training and was looking to start my faculty position. And I have to say, many people came to me at the time and said, well, you're an oncologist. Don't you need to be in a hospital? Don't you need to be next to patients? And despite being at a place without patients, I've always wanted to maintain my connection to the hospital, because I actually, that's part of my identity. I really value seeing my patients, and I hope I am a good physician to them. But I think wearing those two hats, it's been important for me in a couple of ways. First of all, it's kept me very grounded, right? When one is helping real patients confront cancer and make decisions about what to do, you realize that what we're actually trying to accomplish affects real people, and affects real people in a way that matters. And I think that grounding for me is incredibly powerful. And I think that's something that I've always enjoyed sharing with my own lab. And I hope I can bring that perspective to others within the Koch Institute. But I guess I've reflected on this a lot, because in going through sort of this path that I've taken, I've become a real advocate for physician scientists. This is not a career for everybody, but I think there's real power in understanding what the realities are that patients face and what are the real problems in clinical medicine. And I have to say, that comes from clinical training. That comes from being a practicing physician. And whether or not I can continue to see patients, that now has become baked into my identity. And I thought one of the real excitement for me when I first joined the Koch Institute was the opportunity to bring that perspective to other people, right? There was amazing things. Paula Hammond, one of our amazing engineers, was building new layer by layer nanoparticles to improve drug delivery. And I still remember sitting in her office during my recruitment, and we were talking, and I was chatting with her about the drug she was trying to deliver, and thinking through, where is the delivery problem for those drugs and where is it not? Because that's really the way. And that came from being a doctor and having given those drugs to patients and knowing, well, we've done experiments. Sometimes giving more drugs isn't the solution, but in this other case, maybe it is. And so bringing that very practical knowledge to people who could solve problems that I couldn't in a million years myself begin to approach based on my background, for me, was an incredibly exciting opportunity. And I have to say, reflecting now back on the 10 years of the Koch Institute, that's exactly what's happened, right? I think we work together as groups of people and problem solve. And honestly, I think the coolest thing is, in the same way, I mean, you bring this up, I can talk about my clinical life and my research life, but I don't really view those as different things, right? I view myself as a, I don't know, cancer scientist, cancer biologist, cancer doctor, I don't know, whatever label you want to give me. There are all these continuums there, right? And I think
Yeah.
people in our building don't really think of themselves as, I'm a cancer engineer, or I'm a cancer biologist, right? They think of themselves as, we're all bringing our own expertise and our own thinking to try to solve what pieces we can of this really hard problem. And that, I think, that sort of, stripping away of these traditional labels and silos, I think was really the tremendous vision that you guys had. And I think it's been so wildly successful. And in the end, I think it's what makes us special, and will continue to make us special going forward. And it's just an amazing thing to be surrounded by people who bring all of these different expertises and perspectives. And yeah, I guess I have that with my clinician and, basic science biology hat. But I think many people in the Koch Institute wear two hats. And I think it's really all of us mixing together and thinking together that truly makes us a special place.
Yeah, man, it's especially, it's a magical place. And, some of the moments of greatest magic that I've experienced have been at events like The Doctor Is In, where we bring a clinical oncologist in to describe the difficulties she or he encounters and what it actually means. I mean, as a biologist, I can imagine what drug delivery might look like. I have no idea what it really looks like. But there have been moments at these convergence sessions where you can just actually see the magic happening. And you're right. I mean, for me, also, this is one of the most exciting things about the Koch is the conversation that happens across what might be just uncrossable barriers between disciplines. So that's really exciting. And so talk a little bit about the trainees, because often people who do their training in a hybrid environment find that there's no receptor site for them afterwards. But so how do you advise your trainees, or trainees coming into the Koch? Obviously, they're getting their degrees, their undergraduate, their graduate degrees in some particular department, right? But they're coming out as kind of crazy chimeric people, not people who are canonically biologists or canonically engineers or canonically clinicians.
Yeah, I mean, well, the first thing I want to say is that we have spectacular trainees, and for all of us who are being interviewed, you know what? The science is really driven by the trainees, and they really are what make this place special, right? And they really embody all the things that we're talking about. And, I think one of the greatest things about the Koch Institute is the trainees, but I think it's also a self-selecting environment. People come to the Koch Institute because they want that type of environment. They want to be in a place where they can think differently and bring different approaches, different technologies, different ways of thinking together. And I think you're right. It does lead to people who, maybe think differently than the rest of the world, but thinking differently is in the end what leads to impact. And I think I'm incredibly proud of the people who have trained with me and have gone on to other places. And I like to think they bring a little bit of the Koch way of thinking to new places. And hopefully that's the way where we really make transformative change in the world that can extend even beyond what, we can do in our little corner of Main Street here. So I always, I guess, advise my trainees that if one wants to make an impact in the world, one has to ask the hard questions and not be afraid to challenge the dogma, to follow the science, to really think through and take on the challenges of tackling hard problems. And our trainees have that in spades. And I think that's part of why we've been able to accomplish what has been accomplished, in the first 10 years. And I'm sure will be the key to what we can accomplish in the future, right? Because no one can do it alone, right? It's really going to come down to all the amazing people that work at the Koch Institute.
Yeah. So we'll, maybe get some time to come back to some of these really important observations you've just made. But, just I think in terms of framing what the Koch is and giving you a chance to talk a little bit about what the Koch will be, I have to note that just this week, we learned that our auditorium at the Koch Institute in this magnificent building, just over my shoulder here, the auditorium, we've been okay to name it for Salvador Luria, our Favender, as we say at MIT. So if you, just kind of thinking about this incredible arc from Luria to not today, but to tomorrow. So, if you can just talk a little bit about this bridge from our founding to the future, how do you think about that arc and what's next for the Koch Institute?
Yeah, it's incredibly inspiring when one looks back at sort of what was accomplished. We truly stand on the shoulders of giants, right? I mean,
yeah.
Luria came to MIT in the 1950s, late 1950s, and him and the people here at the time really transformed MIT biology from a place that was, studying a very different kind of biology than the molecular biology that we study today, and really led the revolution that came to the understanding of molecular biology and changing genes and oncogenes all the way through to the most modern gene editing technologies that exist today. And there's been various members of our cancer center that have played fabulous roles in building that foundation of our understanding of our modern understanding of cancer biology. And then I think there was a real watershed moment there. There's like, wow, we have this understanding. Now aspects of the cancer problem we can solve. They are things that, we need to apply different solutions to them. Could we come up with better drug delivery? Could we come up with clever new approaches to detect cancer in new ways? And a lot of this was already going on at MIT, but it wasn't part of the Cancer Center. And I think that was really the magic of the Koch Institute, was bringing in, recognizing that MIT had fantastic engineering going on that could be applied to cancer. What if we co-house that with some of the people that made these foundational discoveries? And that, I think, led to many of the things that happen today. And so looking to the future, well, we're at a point where we understand a tremendous amount about cancer. There are problems that I think we can solve and are solving, people in our building are solving. And we need to have an eye towards solving those and building on what we've already accomplished. But at the same time, we also have to remember that there's still things we don't understand, and there's still things that are yet there to be solved. And I think we need to be at the forefront of that too. We really need to make sure that we are making those discoveries that are going to be the problems that we can apply engineering solutions to 10 years from now, 15 years from now. Because, people often come to me and say, well, the National Cancer Act was in 1970 and we declared war on cancer and we still haven't cured cancer. And I guess I'm more hopeful than that. We haven't cured cancer. I don't want to belittle the fact there's many people who still suffer from cancer, and there's many cancers that we still struggle to treat. We have not done a good job there as a community. However, if you look at back, your diagnosis of cancer in the early 70s was an almost certain death sentence. We now cure lots of people with cancer. We control cancer in ways that were unimaginable, that were science fiction at the time when Luria was doing his groundbreaking work. And so if one keeps an eye on the path and the arc of research that's been happening, we're actually accelerating the advances that we're making. The number of new drug approvals is staggering in cancer these days. The companies that are being spun out of the Koch Institute and leading some of these charges are literally changing the way people approach cancer medicine. And I want in the next 10 years that we're leading the next revolution, that we're helping realize the promise of our past, while also laying the foundation to lead the next revolution, so that, 10 years from now, people maybe aren't asking, how come we haven't cured cancer? But, there's these couple cancers that we still struggle with. What can we do about those, right? We've cured the rest of them. But, those are big goals, but I think, I think we're up to the challenge.
I just want to mention, just in probably 5 or 10 minutes, we're going to be opening up for questions. So put your questions in the Q&A, and we'll get to them very soon. But Matt, you mentioned something that I think is something that at MIT we understand, but to people who aren't at MIT, it's kind of hard to understand, in the sense that we have a pretty comfortable relationship with industry. And, in many academic institutions, even today, that's not so comfortable. That, in many places, you still have to throw your discovery over this 12-foot high brick wall to have something happen. And yet, among the things that just astonished me when I arrived at MIT was the number of faculty entrepreneurs who would, start a company and maybe take a sabbatical, leave campus for come back, go back to being a professor, and then, start another company and bring other people along to start a company. And if you, and particularly in the realm of the kind of work that we do at the Koch Institute, I mentioned at the beginning the number of companies that have started up out of the Institute, and that has just accelerated tremendously from when we, first launched the Koch itself in 2007. Can you, having been a number of different places, you're not a lifer at MIT, nor am I. So we have a little bit of culture shock as we join this different kind of community. Would you reflect a little bit for our audience on that very interesting crossroads between academic biology? I mean, we do very fundamental research in all of our disciplines, and yet, our postdocs or our faculty are starting companies that deliver these insights into products that will truly save and change lives.
Yeah, I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head when you said MIT does it differently, and that was something that I guess it was culture shock when I arrived, but culture shock in the best possible way, right? I feel like MIT really understands how the world works, and I've been fortunate to be part of a few, of these startups and early, transition of technology into, into industrial practice. And what has become incredibly clear to me in my experience doing it is that there are things that we do well in academia, and there are things that industry does well, and those things don't always cross, right? And so academia is better at innovation. We're better at coming up with the new crazy idea and trying to de-risk it and making sure it works. But to actually reduce it to practice, there are people in academia, of course, who do that, but industry always is better at that. And I think that is something that people within the Koch Institute understand and are excited about, right? We make a discovery and we want to see it out there in the world and helping people. And that often means like getting that technology into the hands of a commercial venture and helping them do it and working together in a way that's, of course, ethical, but at the same time accomplishes what all of us want to accomplish, which is seeing the discoveries we make actually change lives, exactly what you said. And there's countless examples now of that happening. And I think really creating a culture where we're comfortable with that and we think through the ethical challenges. I think what happens is many places get hung up on, because let's not, beat around the bush. There are ethical challenges to making sure we do this and do this right. And I think many places get hung up on those, but I think those are overcomeable, right? And the results speak for themselves, right? I think, and I love that culture at MIT and the Koch Institute. And I sure hope in the next 10 years, we can continue to foster that entrepreneurial spirit and that really demand to do the right thing, which is, we find something, we should. It's our duty to get it out into the world and actually make a difference for real people.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So, Matt, before we turn to questions, one other opportunity that, again, I didn't really see until I arrived on campus, which is we talk about what we do at the Koch as something that happens only within the building. But you and I both know that while there's some intramural faculty, there are a lot of extramural faculty. And boy, the collaborations between people who are members of the Koch Institute, either extra or intramural, and the opportunities for collaborations across the region are, jaw-dropping. So can you talk a little bit about those relationships with, our neighbors across the street, the Broad, the Whitehead, the Reagan, and the hospitals, and how you think about the opportunities and frankly, how we can draw on more of our regional advantage to approach problems and find solutions in a somewhat different way than might be possible elsewhere in the world.
Yeah. So, I've spent time in hospitals, I've spent time in academic medical centers, and there's a lot of amazing things that happens at all those places. But the Koch Institute brings something different, right? We bring a different perspective. We have, both within our building, but also across our extramural community, we really bring a perspective that, problem solving in engineering, problem solving in computational and data science that, is unique or at least special within our community. And I think because we have a lot to offer, that makes it easy. It makes us an obvious collaborator with many, many people. And I guess I would also say the collaborative spirit, just the whole ethos of how our institute operates, where, the expectation is that we're going to work together and collaborate. That really, I think, sends the right message. It makes people want to come to us, both because of our unique expertise, but because of also our willingness and desire to want to go out and solve problems. We already do this well, I think. There's amazing examples of this. The Bridge Project has been a fabulous innovation in how we can fund collaborative research between us and our friends across the bridge at the Harvard Medical School and Harvard hospitals across the river. But there's more of that, and there could be more of that. I think we could build other bridges to the clinic. One of the challenges of being a cancer center in a place without patients is that we need to work with places that have patients to make sure that the work we're doing is translatable. And I'm certainly open and will look for those opportunities, in the future, as well as, MIT has the new Schwartzman College of Computing, right? I think that's another opportunity. There's going to be a revolution in the coming decades in how we apply computation and big data to healthcare. We should be part of that, right? And MIT has a major effort in the Schwartzman College, and that's an opportunity for how we can bring cancer and computational approaches and machine learning to solve problems in cancer, to think differently, to be part of that coming wave of new way of thinking about solving healthcare problems. And that's a whole other area of collaboration that I am sure we will be a part of in the next 10 years.
Yeah, I'm completely persuaded that computation is going to be a new lane on the super bridge that connects us to our academic medical center colleagues. So let's turn to some of the questions and hear what's on people's minds. So let me just start out with kind of a general question, and I apologize for not knowing from whom they've come because they're just arriving as questions. So I apologize for not being able to recognize members of the audience who specifically asked a question. So what do you see as some of the most promising directions for future cancer research?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And, one of them was one I just covered. Like, what is new in cancer research? What are the things we don't understand? I just led to one. There's going to be an application of machine learning and computational biology to healthcare, right? That is a big question. I think the big question is how do we incorporate this information? What is the best way to use it to solve previously unanswered or unanswerable questions that are important to cancer? And that certainly is one direction. On a more granular level, there's things that I think about in my world, right? Maybe we're at a place where we truly could understand the diet problem in cancer. There's one that patients ask about all the time and we don't have good answers. But maybe we are at a place in understanding where we could understand that. I think, cancer genes, we know a lot about the cancer genes and the mutations that exist in cancer, but we really don't understand the epigenetics. And, for those who don't know what epigenetics are, that is what actually, if every cell has a mutation and two cells behave differently, why the two cells behave differently. That's a problem that, we're reaching a point where I think we could understand that, but we don't yet. I think, speaking from the engineering side and some of my colleagues there, I think we're at a place where early detection is really, I think, the future, right? We know that if we can find cancers earlier, people do better. There's major efforts around the world in early detection. We have some great work going on in the Koch Institute in that area now, new devices, new approaches to think about that problem. But that is a big area that certainly is the future of cancer. And then, another area that I find at least fascinating is this idea of, we treat people, we get good responses. It looks like the cancer is gone, but it comes back later. This idea of why some cells are dormant and become resistant and other ones don't. And I think we've tackled some of the low-hanging explanations for those problems, and I think they need a fundamental shift in understanding to really get to the next level of those things. But answering those questions will be incredibly important if we're going to, really move some of our places where we are okay at treating people but don't get to cures to really moving on to cures. And that's on top of all the other stuff that's going on, cancer immunotherapy, et cetera.
Yeah, so this problem of recurrence, of course, it haunts anyone who's touched by cancer, and understanding where and when. That actually leads me to a question that's come up, which is, what about diagnosis? And certainly this episode with COVID has, I would say, just a humiliating demonstration of our nation's diagnostics deficit. And I know we have a number of colleagues who are working on this. And, in terms of the whole realm of how do we approach cancer, how important is early diagnosis? And how do we, if it is important, how do we move that agenda forward? Because I've forgotten who it was. Someone at the Koch, has mentioned to me, I talk about healthcare and they scoff. It's not healthcare, it's sick care. So, for cancer, probably more importantly than any disease, and, a lot of diseases doesn't make any difference when you diagnose it. We don't have cures, but for cancer, it seems that, this early diagnosis issue is pretty important. What do you think?
It's super important. I mean, we know from study after study after study, and I can say this with authority as an oncologist, if you find cancer earlier, you're almost always better off. And, early diagnosis, as I was saying, I think is super important. And I guess I'm thrilled that we already have a lot of that research going on within our community. Sangeeta Bhatia, for instance, really building really innovative new sensors that can, we hope, lead to earlier diagnosis in some cancers. That without question is the future, but I think this diagnosis question even goes beyond early diagnosis, because if one reflects back again, if we think about what is our history, where have our successes been, some of our biggest successes in treating cancer is better defining subsets, right? When we went from calling it breast cancer to calling it HER2 positive breast cancer versus ER positive breast cancer, that meant that we were developing not a therapy that we were trying to apply to two separate diseases, but that we were applying a therapy to one disease versus another disease. And the better we can diagnose cancer, not just finding it earlier, but also knowing that this patient has a cancer that's different from this other patient, that unquestionably history tells us that is the key to finding better treatments, whether they're treatments early that I'm sure will help people more than treatments late, but it will help on all ends of the spectrum. And that work is incredibly important. And I think this is where some of our engineering faculty are really the best in the world. And it's it's uh it's a really great part about the KI.
So really kind of a precision medicine approach to cancer rather than a vast global epic. Yeah.
Exactly. And I think the opportunity going forward is that, oftentimes people viewed precision medicine as, let's sequence and
Mhm.
use that. But I think we are now knowing that sequencing can be part of the answer, but it doesn't have to be the whole answer, right? Let's bring in some of our other gene expression approaches, things that we can learn from single cell analysis, some
Mhm.
of the, say, sensors that Sangeeta Bhatia is developing, body composition changes, work that my lab has done in collaboration with some of the groups at Dana-Farber. You know, integrating all of that information. And I think this is also where the power of computation, it's an example of where that can come in, right? How do we integrate all of the information, all of the different ways that we can gather things to say that this tumor might be different than that tumor, or this patient may have a cancer and where this one does not? That is really going, I think, in the end, to be the key to really making this diagnosis better, which, like, as I said, will help early detection, but it will also help treatment.
So our wonderful colleague Phil Sharp has a question for you. And he asks, the Koch Institute is at the center of Kendall Square, the hub of biotechnology and pharmaceutical companies. What vision do you have for the interactions of the Koch with these companies?
Oh, well, I mean, that is our secret weapon, of course, is that, it's one of the things that brings great people to the Koch Institute and to MIT because they want to be in the heart of this. And it's also, I think, a tremendous opportunity. It's a tremendous advantage for us, right? Because being so close to these companies just lowers the barrier for us to work together. And as I was saying, there are things that we do well and there's things that industry does well. And having that nearness just makes it so much easier to work together and bring those forward. And look, I personally have had many collaborations with our neighbors in Kendall Square, and I know my colleagues have as well. And I look forward to more of those in the future, and really helping to build those bridges and relationships. And if those companies are listening tonight, we want to work with you. If you have good ideas, we want to help you.
Great. A couple of more specific questions. One person who's watching says, where do you see the Koch Institute's role in making a difference for pediatric and young adult cancer patients? And, these are, when you learn about one of these things, it just breaks your heart and you really are, worried about the time of the course of a disease in a young person.
Oh yeah, without question. I mean, there's, among the most heartbreaking things that there is childhood cancer. And this is an area that is understudied, right? And it's different. Children face different issues. They get cancers for different reasons. They have different challenges in terms of treatment and survivorship. And incorporating those things into our thinking is very important. And in fact, some of that work is happening, right? Some of our colleagues are in fact tackling some of those cancers now and how to think differently about them. um, it needs to be a priority for us, but it needs to be a priority for everybody. I think this is one thing that COVID has exposed, right? Well, COVID affects adults differently than children. The vaccine rules are applied differently between adults and children. Part of that is because there's unique issues with medicine in children that is not faced in adults, and vice versa. And embracing that, I think, is going to be important going forward and is being embraced. So
Yeah. We've got a question from one of our trainees. Colin Fowler says hi to both you and me and Bingley, the golden retriever who's lying on my feet right now. As a KI trainee who's interested in learning more about how the basic biology I do every day translates to the clinic, I'd love more opportunities to make those bench to bedside connections. Do you see a way in which KI trainees, both graduate students and postdocs, and I would undergraduates, can gain more hands-on clinical experience? Really interesting question because,
Yeah.
not everyone is going to dual train in 2 full careers. So
Yeah.
how do we help our trainees have the kind of breadth of understanding that will allow them to have careers like yours, Matt?
Yeah, yeah. Well, the first thing I'll say to Colin is that the work you're doing will make a difference. And and you know, one has to ask basic questions if one is going to find the answers that are unexpected, right? There are things we just don't understand about cancer, and that is going to come from basic discovery. And so that work matters. The hard part is it's sometimes hard to see where those insights are going to come. And
Mhm.
so that's the value of doing good science. And if one does good science and then makes the connections, exactly what Colin is asking, how do you know when you've made that new connection that, hey, this now matters and I should bring it forward? And, Colin knows this, but others on the call may not. The Koch does have some ways we try to do this, right? We have our clinical fellows program where we try to make sure there are people with backgrounds like mine that see patients are in the building and are there and participate in our seminars and our communities and our discussions. And so they're obviously a resource to try to talk science with and say, hey, how does this discovery apply to these things? You mentioned earlier the doctor is in, bringing through patient, clinicians who really focus on discussing here's the real clinical challenges in different diseases. And we did this back with the Bridge Project too, right? When we were trying to do the matchmaking in the Bridge Project, really bringing in people from the Harvard hospitals to talk about some of the cancers that we were focused on and what are the real clinical challenges that they face. But, to really answer Colin's question, just be curious and don't be afraid to ask the questions of the people who know the clinical piece and know that the clinicians want to share that information with you and to take advantage of the things that we have in place. And, also, but just, know that the work you're doing also matters and will be incredibly important if 10 years from now we really have the next set of challenges, the next set of new insight that leads to not the translational opportunities of today, but the translational opportunities of the future.
Yeah, Matt, I mean, there are a few things that have moved me more than talking with our trainees, our, graduate students and postdocs and undergraduates, and to just hear their passion for making a difference and their enthusiasm for being part of this community. And I often make a joke about our wonderful faculty, whom I love, but our faculty are often much more focused on theoretical aspects. And in these, bridge projects, it's the trainees who are, let's just say, nearly lunatic about the possibility of applying basic biology or basic computation to a clinical problem. And, as I say, nothing moves me more than actually seeing the next generation and the opportunities that are open to them, thanks to the kind of education they've gotten and the environment we've provided. So, I mean, I'm always encouraged by where the next generation is going.
Yeah.
We have only a few more questions, and there are a lot of questions in the queue. And so I think what I'll end on, I'm guessing it's going to be more than a 2-minute answer, but we'll try it. There's a question that says, what do you, when you think about the next decade of the Koch Institute, what do you anticipate the funding priorities are going to be?
Oh, the funding priorities. I mean, I think it depends on what you mean in an individual lab or as on a global scale. But I think, I think the funding priorities need to be exactly what we need to do as a Koch Institute. That is, we need to continue what we have been good at, to not forget what got us to where we are today. And that is make sure that we're funding the opportunity to translate our amazing discoveries forward, to improve detection and drug delivery, but at the same time, make sure we're also funding, stocking the pipeline for the future, right? That we're helping Colin make the basic discoveries that he's going to need, to lead to the next big insight. I think the other funding priorities, things that we've already discussed, things like how do we catalyze new ways of thinking about marrying new computational approaches to understanding our data, as well as how can we increase our connections and collaboration, both with our industrial colleagues in Kendall Square, but as well as with the hospitals. Now, I realize I just gave you funding priorities that are huge, but that is what we need to do if we're going to move forward. And I think, we have great people, and, funding is always better, always easier when you have great people doing the work. So.
Yeah, but Matt, one of the things that I would never have guessed when I started as president, that these convergence activities, these multi-institutional possibilities, these catalytic mixing bowls, are not just exciting to us, but they're very exciting to outside funders, and it brings people into our community in ways that I could never have imagined. And frankly, it's not the only place new ideas arise from. It's not the only place where new solutions emerge from. But my dream for the Koch Institute, like yours, is to, I can't imagine where we're going to be in 5 or 10 years, but to catalyze the conversations and the collaborations that are going to invent the future. I mean, that's the nature of fundamental research, right? We don't know where we're going. We just know what we're curious about. And I think to have our colleagues and collaborators across, the area from, fundamental scientists all the way to clinicians in the clinic with the patients, I think, just enriches our environment and makes it highly probable. And of course, in our company colleagues, industry colleagues, makes it highly probable that you will lead us into the Koch Institute's second decade with as much enthusiasm and as much productivity as we've been blessed with in our first. And again, Matt, thank you for this evening's conversation, but thank you so much for your willingness to step up to frankly, the challenge and the opportunity of leading this incredible experiment that has proved so successful in its first decade into its second decade. And I'll be watching with eagerness, and I think everyone who's here tonight wishes you incredible success as you take on the second decade of the Koch Institute.
Well,
thank you so much, Matt.
Yeah, thank you, Susan. Thank you for all you've done for the Koch Institute so far and for hosting tonight. And I really am honored and look forward to the challenge. And, I couldn't have a more wonderful group of people that I work with within the Koch, and I look forward to all that we can accomplish together.
And I'm going to close by noting that neither you nor I is a technical expert, and we are present for this audience by virtue of a small army of people who have made it possible to hurrah and thank you to all the people who put us on these screens this evening. And to those in the audience, we look forward to seeing you at the other anniversary celebrations and other opportunities to come together around activities at the Koch Institute. Thanks for joining us this evening, everybody.